I walked into that interview believing I could finally turn my life around. Instead, they laughed at me, at my clothes, my background, everything I'd worked so hard to overcome. What they didn't know was that their CEO was watching from the shadows. And what happened next changed everything. If you believe everyone deserves a chance, regardless of where they come from, hit that like button right now. Because what you're about to hear is a story that will restore your faith in justice and remind you that karma has a way of finding its mark when you least expect it. My name is Sarah, and 8 months ago, my world fell apart. The restaurant where I'd worked for 3 years suddenly closed its doors. No warning, no severance pay, just a hastily written note taped to the entrance that read, "Closed indefinitely due to financial difficulties." I stood there in my uniform, keys still in my hand, watching my livelihood disappear in an instant. Being a single mother means every decision carries the weight of 2 lives. When I lost my job, I wasn't just losing my income. I was losing my daughter Emma's stability. She was only 6 years old, with bright eyes that looked at me like I could solve any problem in the world. How do you explain to a child that mommy might not be able to keep the lights on this month? The rejection letters started piling up faster than the bills. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Each one felt like a door slamming shut on our future. I applied to grocery stores, retail shops, offices, anywhere that would consider someone with my limited experience. The savings account I'd worked so hard to build was disappearing, $20 at a time, just to keep us fed. I remember the night Emma asked me why we were eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner again. She wasn't complaining. She never complained. But the innocence in her question broke something inside me. I tucked her into bed that night and sat in our tiny kitchen, surrounded by past due notices, wondering how much longer I could keep pretending everything was okay. That's when I saw it, a job posting for an administrative assistant position at Innovate Tech, one of the city's most prestigious technology companies. The salary was more than I'd ever made, with benefits that could change our entire lives. But looking at their sleek website and polished corporate videos, I felt like David staring up at Goliath. Companies like that didn't hire people like me. But desperation has a way of making you brave. I spent hours crafting the perfect application, highlighting every skill I'd learned, every challenge I'd overcome. When they called for an interview, I actually screamed with joy. Emma came running from her room, thinking something was wrong, but when I told her mommy had a chance at a really good job, she hugged me so tight I thought my heart might burst. I had exactly $20 left to my name, and I knew I had to make it count. The thrift store downtown had a small professional section, and I spent an hour going through every blouse, every pair of pants, looking for something that might help me fit in with the corporate world. The saleswoman, an elderly lady with kind eyes, noticed me checking price tags twice and quietly slipped me a discount card. "Good luck, honey," she whispered. "I can tell you're going to do great things." The night before the interview, I practiced my answers in the bathroom mirror while Emma slept. I researched everything I could about Innovate Tech, their values, their mission statement, their recent achievements. They talked about innovation, inclusion, and giving everyone the opportunity to thrive. It felt like a company that might actually see past my circumstances and recognize my potential. Emma woke up early that morning and found me ironing my thrift store blouse for the 3rd time. "Mommy, you look beautiful," she said, and for a moment, I almost believed her. I kissed her goodbye and promised her that no matter what happened, we were going to be okay. Looking back now, I had no idea how prophetic those words would be. Innovate Tech's headquarters was everything I'd imagined and more. A gleaming glass tower that seemed to scrape the sky, with employees in perfectly tailored suits gliding through the marble lobby like they owned the world. I felt every stitch of my second-hand clothes, every scuff on my shoes that I'd tried so hard to polish away. The receptionist barely looked up when I announced my appointment. She pointed toward a bank of elevators with manicured nails that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. As I rode up to the 15th floor, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors and whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening. The waiting area outside the conference room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Expensive artwork hung on pristine white walls, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. I sat on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than my rent, trying to calm my racing heart. When they called my name, I walked into that conference room with my head held high and my best smile ready. 3 people sat across from me at a table that could have seated 12. Marcus, the HR director, was a man in his 40s with steel gray hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. Jennifer, the department head, wore a designer suit that screamed success and looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. David, the senior manager, couldn't have been much older than me, but everything about his posture suggested he thought he was royalty. The interview started professionally enough. They asked about my experience, my skills, my availability. I answered each question with enthusiasm, drawing from every relevant experience I could think of. I could see them taking notes, and for a few minutes, I dared to hope this might actually go well. Then Marcus noticed my blouse. I watched his eyes narrow as he took in the slightly faded fabric, the way it didn't quite sit perfectly, despite my best efforts. "Interesting choice of attire," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Very thrifty." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was a specimen under a microscope. "Tell me, Sarah," she said, pronouncing my name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "How do you think someone with your background would handle interactions with our high-profile clients?" I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my voice steady. "I believe my experience in customer service has taught me how to connect with people from all walks of life. I'm confident I can represent your company professionally." David actually laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was sharp and cruel, like glass breaking. "A single mother from the service industry representing Innovate Tech. That's rich." He looked at his colleagues, and I watched them exchange glances that spoke volumes about what they really thought of me. The questions became increasingly hostile. They picked apart every line of my resume, questioned every gap in my employment, and made snide comments about my education. When I mentioned that I'd been a single mother since Emma was born, trying to explain the challenges I'd overcome, Marcus actually rolled his eyes. "Look, Sarah," Jennifer said, not bothering to hide her impatience anymore. "We appreciate you taking the time to come in, but let's be realistic here. Innovate Tech has a certain image to maintain. We need someone who fits our corporate culture, someone who can represent us at the highest levels." I'm sure you understand. I understood perfectly. They were telling me I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong in their world of glass towers and designer suits. They were rejecting me not because I lacked skills or dedication, but because I looked like someone who shopped at thrift stores and counted pennies at the grocery store. Because I was them. "Perhaps you'd be better suited for opportunities more aligned with your experience level," David suggested, his tone making it clear exactly what kind of opportunities he meant. "I'm sure there are plenty of restaurants hiring." The final blow came when Marcus stood up, clearly signaling the interview was over. "We'll be in touch," he said. But we all knew that was a lie. As I gathered my purse and what was left of my dignity, I heard Jennifer whisper something to David that made him chuckle. I couldn't make out the words, but the cruelty in their laughter was unmistakable. A security guard appeared to escort me out, as if I might steal something on my way to the elevator. He was a kind-faced man who looked genuinely uncomfortable with his assignment. As we walked through the lobby, he quietly said, "I'm sorry, miss. That wasn't right what happened up there." His words were meant to comfort, but they only confirmed what I already knew. I'd been humiliated, and everyone could see it. What I didn't know was that someone else had witnessed the entire exchange. Michael Chen, the CEO and founder of Innovate Tech, had been in the adjacent conference room, preparing for his own meeting, when he heard voices through the thin wall. At first, he'd tried to ignore the conversation, but something about the tone made him pause. Corporate interviews were usually polite, professional affairs. This sounded different, harsh, dismissive, cruel. Michael had built Innovate Tech from nothing, starting in his garage with a vision of creating technology that could change the world. But more than that, he'd founded the company on principles his immigrant parents had taught him: that everyone deserved respect, that hard work mattered more than appearances, and that judging someone by their circumstances rather than their character was the fastest way to miss out on extraordinary talent. As he listened to my interview through the wall, Michael felt his blood pressure rising. He heard Marcus's comment about my clothes, Jennifer's condescending questions about my background, and David's cruel laughter when I mentioned being a single mother. This wasn't just unprofessional. It went against everything he'd tried to build at Innovate Tech. Unable to contain himself, Michael quietly moved to the small window that connected the two conference rooms. It was designed for overflow meetings, with one-way glass that allowed observation without being seen. What he witnessed in those final minutes of my interview made his hands shake with anger. He watched me sit there with perfect posture, answering their hostile questions with grace and dignity while they treated me like garbage. He saw the moment my shoulders tensed when Marcus made his comment about my appearance, the way my hands trembled slightly when Jennifer questioned my ability to represent the company. But what struck him most was that through it all, I never fought back, never became defensive or rude. I maintained my professionalism, even as they stripped away my dignity piece by piece. When they dismissed me and called security, Michael had to grip the windowsill to keep from storming into the room. He watched the security guard, James, a good man who'd worked for the company for 8 years, escort me out with visible discomfort. The whole scene was a betrayal of everything Innovate Tech claimed to stand for. Michael's own story flooded back to him as he watched me disappear into the elevator. 25 years ago, he'd been in my shoes, an immigrant son with secondhand clothes and big dreams, facing interview panels who saw his accent and assumed he wasn't smart enough, successful enough, American enough to succeed in their world. He'd built Innovate Tech, partly to prove them wrong, but also to create the kind of company that would never make anyone feel the way he'd felt in those early days. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he'd been upstairs creating a company culture of inclusion and innovation, his own employees had been downstairs perpetuating the exact kind of discrimination he'd worked so hard to eliminate. It was a failure of leadership that cut him to the core. Within minutes of my departure, Michael was on the phone with his head of security, requesting the full video recording of the interview. Innovate Tech recorded all interviews for training and legal purposes, but Michael had never felt the need to review them personally. Today was different. Today, he needed to see exactly what kind of culture he'd unknowingly allowed to fester in his own company. That evening, Michael sat in his office, long after everyone else had gone home, watching the interview recording over and over again. Each viewing made him angrier and more determined to make things right. He could see details he'd missed while observing through the window. The way Marcus had smirked when reviewing my resume. How Jennifer had whispered something to David that made him laugh before I'd even finished introducing myself. The casual cruelty with which they'd dismissed not just my application, but my worth as a human being. Michael began digging deeper into the hiring practices of his HR department. What he found horrified him. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Marcus, Jennifer, and David had been conducting interviews like this for months, systematically weeding out candidates who didn't fit their narrow definition of Innovate Tech material. Qualified applicants were being rejected not for their skills or experience, but for their zip codes, their accents, their clothes, their backgrounds. He found emails between the three of them mocking candidates, making jokes about people's appearances, and openly discussing how to avoid hiring anyone who might lower the company's image. It was exactly the kind of toxic culture that killed innovation and drove away the diverse talent that made companies truly successful. But it was the follow-up report they'd filed about my interview. That night, Michael barely slept. He kept thinking about his mother, who'd cleaned office buildings for 20 years while putting herself through night school to become a teacher. She'd faced the same kind of discrimination, the same assumptions about her worth based on her appearance and circumstances. She'd taught him that true character was revealed not in how you treated people who could help you, but in how you treated people who couldn't. The next morning, Michael called an emergency meeting with his legal team and senior leadership. The 3 employees who'd conducted my interview were suspended pending a full investigation, but Michael knew that firing them, while necessary, wasn't enough. He needed to find me and make this right. It took his assistant 2 hours of detective work to track down my contact information. When Michael finally dialed my number, his hands were shaking. How do you apologize for something so fundamentally wrong? How do you undo humiliation and restore dignity with a phone call? When my phone rang 2 days after the interview, I almost didn't answer. I'd been expecting rejection calls all week, and my heart couldn't take another polite dismissal. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Sarah, this is Michael Chen from Innovate Tech. I was wondering if you might have time to come in and speak with me today." I nearly dropped the phone. The CEO? Why would the CEO be calling me? My first thought was that I'd somehow gotten one of those horrible interviewers in trouble, and they were calling to make sure I wouldn't sue or cause problems. I stammered out that yes, I could come in, though I had no idea why he wanted to see me. "I'll explain everything when you get here," Michael said, and there was something in his voice, a warmth, a respect, that I hadn't heard from anyone at Innovate Tech before. "And Sarah, I want you to know that what happened in your interview was completely unacceptable. I'm truly sorry you were treated that way." I sat staring at my phone for a full minute after he hung up. Emma was at school, and I had the afternoon free, but I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. The CEO of Innovate Tech was apologizing to me. It felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life. I wore the same thrift store outfit I'd worn to the first interview. It was the only professional clothing I owned, and I wasn't about to spend money I didn't have on new clothes for what might be another humiliation. But as I walked back into that gleaming lobby, everything felt different. The same receptionist who'd barely acknowledged me before looked up with surprise when I announced I was there to see Mr. Chen. Instead of the conference room where I'd been torn apart, I was escorted to the executive floor, to an office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that took my breath away. Michael Chen stood as I entered, extending his hand with a genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his late 40s, with kind eyes and an energy that filled the room. "Sarah, thank you so much for coming back," he said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "I know this must be confusing, but I promise I'll explain everything." And he did. Michael told me about overhearing my interview, about watching through the connecting window, about his horror at witnessing how I'd been treated. He showed me the recording, not to embarrass me further, but to demonstrate that he'd seen exactly what had happened and knew it was wrong. "This isn't who we are," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the company I built or the culture I wanted to create. What those 3 people did to you was discriminatory, unprofessional, and completely contrary to our values. I am deeply, personally sorry for the way you were treated." I felt tears prick my eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of frustration or defeat. Someone had seen what happened to me and recognized it for what it was. Someone in power had witnessed my humiliation and decided to act. "I've terminated their employment," Michael continued, "all 3 of them, and I want to offer you a position. Not the administrative assistant role you originally applied for, but something better. How would you feel about becoming my executive assistant?" The room seemed to spin around me. Executive assistant to the CEO. It was a position I'd never dreamed I could qualify for. with a salary that would solve every financial problem Emma and I faced. But more than the money, more than the prestige, it was the respect in Michael's voice that made me want to cry. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why me? Why this?" Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because in that interview, under circumstances that would have broken most people, you showed more professionalism and grace than employees I've worked with for years. Because when they attacked your character, the next week was a whirlwind of changes that felt like stepping into someone else's life. My first day at Innovate Tech as executive assistant to the CEO was everything the original interview should have been. Welcoming, respectful, exciting. Michael introduced me to the senior staff as a valued addition to the team, and I felt like I was finally where I belonged. But the sweetest moment came on my third day, when I was reviewing the morning schedule with Michael and heard a commotion in the lobby below. Through his office window, we could see security escorting three familiar figures out of the building: Marcus, Jennifer, and David, carrying boxes of their personal belongings, looking shell-shocked and humiliated. The irony was perfect. They were being walked out by the same security guard who had escorted me from the building after they'd humiliated me. James caught my eye through the window and gave me the smallest smile and nod. Justice had a poetic beauty to it. Michael stood beside me, watching his former employees disappear into the parking garage. "They've been blacklisted from every major company in the city," he said quietly. "Word travels fast in our industry, especially when it comes to discrimination lawsuits." I learned later that other victims of their discriminatory practices had come forward once news of their firing became public. Innovate Tech settled several lawsuits and implemented comprehensive bias training for all hiring managers. The company's reputation, rather than being damaged by the scandal, was actually enhanced by Michael's swift and decisive response. Emma visited me at work that Friday, her eyes wide as she took in the executive floor, with its impressive artwork and breathtaking views. She was so proud of her mommy working in the fancy building, and seeing the respect with which my colleagues treated me made her stand a little taller. For the first time in her young life, she got to see her mother valued and appreciated for who she truly was. The financial transformation was immediate and profound. My first paycheck was more than I'd made in 3 months at the restaurant. We moved out of our cramped apartment into a beautiful 2-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood with good schools. Emma got new clothes, new books, and the security of knowing mommy could take care of her without counting every penny. But the emotional transformation was even more significant. I woke up each morning excited to go to work, valued as a professional, respected as a person. Michael became not just a boss, but a mentor, helping me develop skills I never knew I had and confidence I'd never thought possible. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same conference room where I'd been humiliated, but this time I was on the other side of the table. Michael had asked me to help develop new interview protocols and occasionally sit in on candidate meetings to ensure our hiring process truly reflected our values. The candidate across from me was a young man in an ill-fitting suit, nervous energy radiating from every pore. His resume showed gaps in employment, a background in food service, and a determination to break into the corporate world that reminded me painfully of myself. I watched him answer questions with the same mixture of hope and desperation I'd felt in this very room. When the interview ended and the candidate left, the hiring manager turned to me for my assessment. 6 months ago, I would have been that candidate. Today, I was part of the team deciding his future. "He's hungry," I said, remembering Michael's words to me about recognizing potential over polish. "He's smart, he's motivated, and he's exactly the kind of person who will work twice as hard as anyone else because he knows what it means to get a real chance. I think we should hire him." And we did. Watching him receive that call, hearing the joy and relief in his voice, reminded me of how dramatically my own life had changed because one person decided to look beyond appearances and see potential. The three people who destroyed my dignity in that first interview learned a harsh lesson about karma. Marcus, Jennifer, and David all struggled to find new employment after being fired. Their discriminatory practices had been documented and shared throughout the industry, making them toxic hires for any company concerned about legal liability or ethical standards. I heard through industry connections that Marcus was working at a much smaller firm for half his previous salary. Jennifer had to relocate to another state to find work, starting over in a junior position despite her years of experience. David, the youngest of the three, had been forced to leave the corporate world entirely and was reportedly working in retail, the kind of job he'd suggested I pursue instead of dreaming beyond my station. The universe has a way of balancing the scales, of ensuring that cruelty eventually finds its way back to those who practice it. They had judged me unworthy based on my circumstances, never imagining that their own circumstances could change just as quickly. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about justice, second chances, and the incredible things that happen when good people refuse to let cruelty win. Because at the end of the day, we all have the power to be like Michael Chen, to see past appearances, to recognize potential, and to use our positions of influence to lift others up instead of tearing them down. Sometimes karma needs a helping hand, and sometimes that helping hand can be yours. Your support means everything to creators like me, who believe in sharing stories that matter. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale of justice served and dreams fulfilled. Until next time, remember that no matter what room you're sitting in, you belong there, and your worth isn't determined by anyone else's limited vision of who you should be.